author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we are talking wide-ranging politics from the Beltway and beyond. We're going to cover a lot of ground. Please remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. We've got a lot to cover. It's going to be a great show. Let's crack on to it. And you're on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and we're very fortunate to be joined by Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
So instead of a basic Q&A type thing on a particular subject, Tim, what I thought we'd go for now is a bit more a wide-ranging discussion based around what's happening politically in the country, because it seems to me that if you examine the basic media things every morning, so the media organs, the newspapers, the internet, etc., what you find is that everybody's talking about one topic. It's USAID, but there's so much USAID, but there's so much more going on, and I wonder if the media organs are struggling because there is so much actually happening, and how does that really play into the first 100 days of a Trump agenda, as it were?
Well, I think many of us, myself included, and I think I speak for you as well, Mark, we're getting what I would call journalistic whiplash from having to turn our head to so many things at one time. I mean, in a way, Trump is doing more in a day, or certainly in a week, than Joe Biden did in his entire 4 years. And Trump is speaking to the press almost every day. He will answer every question thrown at him. He'll give a very honest answer, as honest as he can be, I think. But there's so many initiatives and so little time. I mean, he is treating each day, each week, as if it's his last week in office, because he has so much that he wanted to do in his first administration and could not do, largely because of the obstruction of Democrats and the concocted scandals such as the Russia hoax that really took up 2 years of his attention. And he's absolutely intent on not allowing that to happen again. So each day there's sort of a theme. So on one day this week, it's the Department of Defense. Then he's going to move on to the Department of Education, and he's going to, basically do triage, whichever he thinks needs the most attention, the places that have the most fraud, corruption, waste, abuse. And it's interesting, Mark, I'm sure you've got this too from years of following politics, that every politician comes in and says, well, we're going to affect a lot of savings by eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse, but they never do. This time, Trump actually means it. And the Department of Defense is a particularly ripe target because it has an $800 billion budget and has tens of thousands of civilian employees. And with the cooperation of Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, I'm sure they will uncover untold tens, maybe hundreds of millions, billions in illegitimate spending, duplicative spending, in bloat and redundancy. And that's the problem as much as anything else, is that one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. So you're getting repetitive programs that cost the taxpayer so much money.
Yeah, it's definitely a case of there's so many niche departments within departments and work groups and process groups that there's an overlap of all the work. And now I know a lot of people are excited about, AI being able to identify these things. I'm not overly convinced that that's a great alternative to somebody with a decent mind sitting down and or essentially auditing what every program does and where it comes in. But there's a very sorry, what's the best way to say this? So this budget of 800 billion, it keeps going up, even though the United States is less involved in wars. So in 2023, which I think that was an 830 billion budget, just off the top of my head, um, the US was involved in Afghanistan. Now the US is no longer involved in Afghanistan, or at least militarily. And yet the budget keeps going up. Now, surely there should be some reduction in there. Once something is completed, you don't keep on paying unless, of course, we need the next Blues Clues for Afghanistan to go with the Sesame Street ones in Iraq and Pakistan.
I think the group that should be afraid, maybe very afraid, is what they call the Beltway Bandits, who are the private defense contractors who have been feeding at the trough for years. They're notorious around the Washington, D.C. area. And I think the gravy train is about to end. And the best the Democrats can do is to howl into the darkness about the unfairness of it all, about how Elon Musk is an unelected official, which is particularly rich, considering that the bureaucracy is basically a large holding place for every unelected, over-authorized person who has remarkable decision-making powers that people don't even realize because they're so distant from everyday Americans. And this is what Trump, I think it's important to say that, for all the savings that we will get through Doge, and supposedly there's already been roughly 36 billion identified as wasteful or corrupt spending. We do have a $7 trillion budget. So even if Doge and Trump and Musk are able to uncover 200-300 billion, that's not nearly as significant as the fact that the American people will finally see that their money is no longer going down a federal rat hole, which they suspected for a long time, but they didn't have the actual evidence of it. Now they will. And sunlight being the best disinfectant, the fact that these illegitimate expenditures and these DEI programs and these progressive boondoggles aren't being unmasked one at a time every single day. And the Democrats, you will notice, they are not defending these individual expenditures. What they're outraged about is the process itself and the fact that the process is taking place. As I wrote on LibertyNation.com, the likes of Chuck Schumer and Elizabeth Warren and Maxine Waters figured the American people would forever remain none the wiser. Well, not anymore.
Absolutely. We're going to continue this conversation after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we continue to be joined by Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Tim Donner. Tim, we were just talking about how the Democrats in the Senate and the House are rather upset by Elon Musk's efforts with Doge. And you pointed out that they seem quite upset that, and they're not defending each individual program, but rather they are decrying the fact that the public is really finding out at what this money has been spent on. And a couple of things I'd like to throw at you there is we've heard specifically that Elon Musk is unelected and has access to your social security number. A couple of things that I'd love to get your opinion on there is, number one, how many people within the USAID or the Treasury or the State Department have access to one's social security number? Probably everybody with access to a computer, right? And how many of those people are elected? I guess the answer there is a big fat zero.
Yes.
So why would Elon Musk be any different as somebody who's coming in to oversee? And the second thing that I'd really love you to come back on is you mentioned that they're not defending the spendings that have been made, but surely if these are cut this year, or if they're stopped because the money's already gone, that's the reality, right? If it's on those computer systems, the money's probably already gone. But it'll be next year that there starts to be a reduction, if there is one, in outgoings, which would then, assuming Donald Trump can get a bill passed that in the houses that reduces outlays, then that's where the big money savings will come from, right?
Yes, that's true. Well, the best that the left can do and the Democrats is to try and scare people into believing that Elon Musk is interested in your social security number so he can deprive you of your social security check. They're also, which is probably the last thing that Musk and his team of like 20 something computer geek geniuses that he has used to uncover just mountains of fraudulent, wasteful, repetitive, redundant, bloated spending. The last thing he's interested in is depriving anyone of their Social Security checks. But at the same time, I think it's becoming more and more clear that an awful lot of Social Security checks are going out to people who should not be receiving them. Those checks are going out to people who don't have a Social Security number, to people who have multiple Social Security numbers, for example, as best we understand it. So yes, there's abuse in that system, but the last thing he's going to do is deprive anybody who has a legitimate claim to Social Security from getting their money. Now, this is a system, Social Security, that for the first time is spending more than it's taking in, because the baby boomer generation, the largest in American history, is coming of age now, coming of retirement age. So the books are not balancing in Social Security, a system that has a so-called Social Security Trust Fund, which is always rated by the federal government, which then puts in a essentially worthless IOU into the Social Security Trust Fund, saying, we owe you this much. Of course, they never pay that back. So these are the kind of things, these are the kind of maneuvers that the federal government has been making for decades, with Americans having no clue, first of all, of what's going on, and where they've largely thrown up their hands and said, I guess there's just nothing we can do about it because it's so distant and so unaccountable, this bureaucracy. Well, Trump is trying to change that. And in terms of systemic change, nothing could be more significant than actually casting sunlight on all the ways that taxpayer money is being spent.
When you said about the U.S. government, the federal government dipping into the Social Security pot with IOUs, I think Robert Maxwell did something similar before his vast disappearing act. That money's never been recovered either. It seems to me, Tim, that what you say about Social Security, there's the issue that I think Trump might be trying to address, because the incomings don't match the outgoings, and that's a problem because the federal government, through its Social Security programs, has a lot of money that's going to have to pay out. A lot of money coming because of the boom generation. But if they can fill the government coffers with tariffs, because tariffs, we hear about all it's the consumer that pays the tariffs. Well, not directly, certainly. That money goes directly to the federal government from those who are importing, and so they can make a pot of cash. And I wonder why so many people are pushing back on this, when that could be the only thing that can really save Social Security.
Well, Trump, of course, has hinted at creating a Department of External Revenue, which would be a clearinghouse for all the tariffs collected from foreign countries. And I think the important thing to point out about tariffs is, and of course, many conservatives, maybe most of them, oppose tariffs. They still have Vietnam flashbacks about the Smoot-Hawley Act in the 1920s that helped lead to the Depression. But I think there's two ways to look at tariffs. If tariffs are used to prop up failing industries that could not stand on their own, then they can be economically disastrous because it's pure protectionism. But if tariffs are being used, as Trump apparently intends to use them, to level the playing field so that we pay $200 billion to Canada, okay, as a basic subsidy, but they pay us just a fraction of that, likewise with Mexico, likewise with China. If it's done to create an imbalance or to correct an imbalance in trade, then it can be very effective if, as the United States is, a country of maximum leverage as the only real superpower in the world. I guess you could count China, but of course China is not a free country. So I think it's the intent of tariffs that will determine whether they are effective or not. Again, if you use them to prop up an industry that could not otherwise succeed, it's going to create the kind of disaster that the free market types object to or that they foresee. But using it to level the playing field, as Trump intends, is a very different thing. And I think ultimately, since he is not interested in anything but making America great again, making it stronger, making it more powerful, making it safer, more secure, all of those things, that tariffs can be a very effective tool if the chief executive has the stomach to fight off all the objections, both from free market types and from Democrats and from world leaders.
Yeah, I find it fascinating when people say that tariffs aren't a subsidy because, as we pointed out, the tariffs go to the government. So if there's a tariff imbalance between two countries, that's essentially, let's say one country's paying 100 billion into the US, but the US is paying 200 billion out. That's 100 billion in free cash that the foreign government gets.
And he understands, Trump understands that these foreign countries must have access to the American market. Because if they don't, their own economies are going to suffer. I mean, what would it be like for China if they didn't have access to American markets where people buy cheap Chinese goods every single day in massive numbers? That would collapse the Chinese economy. So Trump realizes that, and he's using that leverage, unlike most presidents in the past.
It is indeed all about leverage. We're going to be back with Tim Donner after this short break to discuss what else is happening in the United States political scene. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I remain your host, Mark Angelides. We're continuing our long conversation with Tim Donner, Liberty Nation senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show. Now, Tim, I think we've really run the gamut on many topics that are impacting Washington, D.C. and the country around it, from as you call them, the Beltway bandits and beyond. But I guess it's time we've got to dive into USAID and the reactions to that. Now, I've got a clip. It's quite a long one, but it's from Democrat Jamie Raskin. So, Tim, have a quick listen to this and let me know what you think coming out.
The CFPB, which is now under attack, which has essentially been shut down de facto by Elon Musk, saves Americans $15 billion a year. It got consumers $17.5 billion back since 2011. So they're shutting down the agencies that help the American people. The EPA gives us clean air and clean water. The NLRB and the Labor Department, which have been targeted, are defending the right to organize into a union. and to collectively bargain. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau protects all of us against rip-off practices by banks and so on, and it's not enough for Elon Musk to arrogate to himself the unilateral power which belongs to Congress and shut down agencies that we've created and that we've appropriated funds for.
What do you make of that?
Well, I'll tell you what, if the Democrats want to play the numbers game, they're fighting a losing battle, because the numbers are the things that Elon Musk and Doge and Trump are unmasking. The tens of billions, probably hundreds of billions of dollars of spending, of which the American people would certainly not approve. DEI programs, transgender operas, things like this. I mean, you just take 5 things. We'll just pick 5 of the dozens of USAID programs. And by the way, whoever heard of USAID really before this? American people thought that it was, a well-intentioned agency that sent food and supplies and money to the needy across the world, because they thought AID meant just aid. But it's the Agency for International Development. And what they're developing is a progressive agenda to try and spread across the world. Well, the list of head-spinning expenditures by USAID and other federal agencies is almost incomprehensible. Let's go with 5 of them, just to give examples. $32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru, $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia, and it keeps getting larger and larger. $70,000 for a DEI musical in Ireland, $1.5 million to, quote, advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, in Serbia, $2 million for sex changes and LGBT activism in Guatemala. These are the kind of things that are hidden from the American people, that are clearly on the progressive docket.
There's a theme there I'm noticing, Tim.
Yes,
There's an absolute theme.
Well, see, they cannot win with these type of policies at the ballot box, and they cannot sell them to the American people publicly. So what they do is they use the cover of darkness of the federal bureaucracy to push these things through. They've already been spent. Now, presumably they won't be, as you pointed out earlier. The big changes will hopefully be in the 2025 budget, if they even come up with a budget, because of course we know the Democrats are now threatening to shut down the government. But it also seems to me, in the way of observations, that the Democratic Party has picked the worst possible messengers for their outrage. I mean, Maxine Waters is out there day after day, just howling into the darkness, screaming about the unfairness of it all, without defending any of the individual expenditures that have been unmasked. I don't think that Maxine Waters is the kind of person that many Americans are going to much listen to, nor is Elizabeth Warren, who, of course, has become something of a laugh line ever since the whole Pocahontas. And
Tim, be fair, she's only 1,096th of a laugh line. 1,096th of a laugh.
I really think if I had my DNA tested, I would probably have at least as high a percentage as her. But these are the people that are expressing outrage. They're the front people, which is remarkable to me, because these are people who really have a very poor reputation among the American people. I think of that little so-called rally last week, which was so pathetic, with Maxine Waters and Chuck Schumer raising their hands and saying, "We will win, we will win," with no basis for saying that, because they've already lost, right? The game is already over. I mean, it's like that Trump is ahead by 65 points in the fourth quarter of the football game, and they are trying to pretend they can come back and win the game. As my recent article on LN has stated, DC will never be the same with what Trump is doing across every agency, across every cabinet position. And the big difference, of course, this time, Mark, as opposed to his first administration, is that he has reliable allies heading up every cabinet department and agency. Whereas the first time he came in, he was forced to settle for Washington insiders who were recommended to him, whom he did not know, and who, in many ways, didn't even trust him very much. That's not going to happen this time.
Yeah, it seems the nominees are actually moving ahead at quite a pace. At time of recording,
You might say warp speed.
warp speed indeed. Yeah, at time of recording, Tulsi Gabbard has yet to have the full floor vote, although based on the numbers I'm looking at on this day, it looks like she's got enough. And then there's Robert F. Kennedy, and I guess he's the last. He and Kash Patel are the last.
Kash Patel as well,
Yeah,
yes.
they're the last big ones. Everything else should be pretty plain sailing. But at time of recording, I must put that in. I suspect they are all going to go through, including maybe by a vice presidential tiebreaker, Robert F. Kennedy.
Well, I think that it's pretty clear that there is not more than 3 votes among Republicans to reject their nominations, which means at worst, Vice President Vance will cast a tie-breaking vote, but it may not even come to that. I mean, Mitch McConnell was able to oppose the nomination of Pete Hegseth, I think mostly because they could afford to lose him, so they said, go ahead and make whatever statement you have to make by voting against him. But nobody wants to incur the wrath of Trump in the Republican Party. And so it's unlikely that any of these 3 would be rejected. And then Trump will have his full team together.
It's going to be chaos. It's going to be a mad, bad, beautiful chaos on the world stage. And in fact, that kind of brings me on to something that I did want to discuss. And it seems to me that what's happening in Washington, D.C. with Donald Trump and his cabinet is actually impacting politics around the world in it's rather a mad array of the end of a globalist hegemony. Now, that might sound like a bit hyperbolic, but I can make the case, and we'll do so after this short break. See you soon.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, continuing our conversation with Tim Donner. Now, Tim, just for the break, I put forth a wild theory that what's happening in Washington, D.C. is actually crumbling a more globalist mindset around the world. And I want to make my case to you here. And if it all makes sense, I might even write this up for the pages of libertynation.com, delving a little bit deeper. So what's happening is there's been a very cozy consensus on the world stage about what should happen in terms of policies. There's been no real surprises. There's been known knowns. There's been known unknowns. We're talking about the Rumsfeld matrix.
The Donald Rumsfeld doctrine, right?
Yeah. But Donald Trump has introduced something else, and those are the unknown knowns and the unknown unknowns on the 4 corners of the Rumsfeld matrix. I love the term the Rumsfeld matrix. And so what's happening is, where there's always a consensus on what can happen, there was a slow deliberative process to things that happen, and this was all collectively managed or managed in a collectivist manner by places like the United Nations, the WEF, and various other supranational organizations. But with Donald Trump, he's forcing individual countries to be dynamic. So on Monday, February 10th, he imposed a 25% steel tariff, a steel and iron tariff, I think it was, or steel and aluminum tariff. And so what happened was, for example, on Canada, went completely mad with it and started putting out statements about, we got to do this, we got to do that. But what was happening was they started operating. Now, we don't know what the end result of that will be, but they started working towards coming up with a solution that was beneficial purely for Canada in that arrangement. There wasn't any cooperation with outside organizations or the general globalist community because they have to react on a fast-paced basis. So the decision-making mechanisms have to be brought closer to the decision-making authority. And so when that happens, you're forcing nation states to be individually dynamic in how they deal with internal politics and, for example, exports and the global stage, which is cutting the global power players out. But it's also cutting the people who have an interest in a global leadership. It's cutting them apart from their compatriots within that movement because they need to operate on a Canada first basis, a Mexico first basis.
Yes.
And that's my theory. So what do you make of it?
Well, what I would do to support that theory is something that Donald Trump said during his first term that went largely unnoticed or unreported. He said, yes, I believe we have to make America great again. We need an America first agenda. But then he said, but every country should do that. Italy should be Italy first. Brazil should be Brazil first. England should be England first. In other words, he's saying you should defend your own sovereignty the same way that we are. And then we would have an equitable world that wasn't dominated by this global mindset. And I note that in your own United Kingdom, that Nigel Farage is now the most popular among the three parties, the
Yes.
Brexit, the Conservative, and the Labour Party. He has now soared in popularity, which is, something that even after Brexit, which Farage mostly led the movement, he was not anywhere near the most popular politician. But that reflects on another fact. The way that Trump has forced these countries to defend their own sovereignty and their own interests is because things come closer to home. And he who governs least governs best is the old statement, but it's also true on a domestic basis that what Trump is trying to do is remove the federal government every place that the authority can go to the individual states, which is why he wants to, for example, disperse the Department of Education. He wants to end it and send direct block grants to states to decide because the state is far closer to its population than the federal government is, and even more so local government. In other words, the closer a government is to its constituents, the more accountable it must be. That's a very basic principle. But I think Trump is also working on one other factor, and it's sort of the crazy man factor. In other words, these countries say, you never know what Trump might do. We better be really careful with this guy. And I think he plays that up. He wants to keep it beyond everything else. He wants to keep people off balance and believing he's willing to do almost anything to get his way.
That I'm not an economist and I don't play one on television, but there's within game theory, there's a couple of ideas. There's one, there's the Nash equilibrium by John Nash, and that's that if you're in a non-cooperative game, no player can gain an advantage by changing their strategy. That's essentially the globalist position, right? With some exceptions, of
Yes.
course. And then you have the I think it's called the dominant strategy, that is that each player's optimal move is or should be unaffected by those of the other players. And we seem to have forgotten that Donald Trump, even though he's all America first, he is about competition very, very much. He wants America to be number one. And how are you number one? Well, by measuring yourself against other nations. So he's not saying that you have to, for him to win, somebody else has to lose. But what he's just saying is that
Yes.
I should win, and it should be very clear that I've won.
In other words, globalism is essentially a zero-sum game.
Yes.
Whereas the Trump philosophy is a plus-sum game,
Yes.
where every player is going to benefit by competing. And that's just human nature. Competition brings out the best in people because it forces them to compete. And when you're forced to compete, that stimulates creativity, it stimulates focus, to be sure, and it stimulates the need to satisfy your own constituents in competition against the rest of the world. But globalism basically is a vanilla, one-size-fits-all philosophy that has been discredited and is no longer popular with the American people, and as you've pointed out rightly, ever more unpopular across the world. You can see this in England and in Germany and throughout Europe. And increasingly, I think it will hit South America and Africa as well.
With Drive, that drive has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty over the last 100 years. Whereas the opposite of that competitive streak, that open competitive market position is often the socialist type or even the communist type in many
because
cases.
there are no free elections.
Yeah.
So therefore the dictator or whoever, whatever he calls himself, is not forced to compete. He's not forced to come up with solutions, chairman, whatever you want to call it. That's why democracy, the most important feature of democracy is elections, because every candidate has to compete by offering what they think is superior to the voters. And that competition forces politicians in the long run to perform. And if they don't, they know they're going to get kicked out of office. Witness Joe Biden.
Yeah, it also reins people into the middle as well when they're campaigning, because nobody on either extreme, the left or the right, can really definitely get elected, so that they tend to move towards the center. Now, where do you think, just a quick final question for you, Tim, where do you think that political center is today?
Well, I think America always has been a right of center country that occasionally strays to the left with a strong personality like a Barack Obama. But I think people are in a different mindset because they now actually believe that they could have restored confidence in their government because they're finding out what they've been doing for these many decades. And they know that the person in charge is trying to do something to rebuild that long lost confidence among the American people.
Tim Donner, thanks for a great conversation.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guest today, longtime host of this here radio show, Tim Donner, for his wit, his wisdom, and all-round super knowledge. And of course, thank you guys, the listeners at home, for taking the time to tune in each week and join us. Please remember, LibertyNation.com does not sponsor campaigns, candidates, or legislation. And this presentation is no endorsement. Thanks for being here.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.